I took the occasion to take a look at what we had done last week, and I learned something. I need a haircut. Let's take a quick gander at what we did last week. Last week, we looked at some of the older literature that told us something about history. And we found out that we could learn something about history, even the things that were not written in scientific or what you'd call classical Greek history genre. The Iliad and the Odyssey, we talked a little bit about that. These historical stories do have some value, I said, however, from the things that we get from archaeology. Now, what I really got concerned with last week, I didn't get too far into, and that is what was the nature of these stories, both in the Iliad and Odyssey and in the Old Testament. The Homer stories are very straightforward in that they deal with heroes doing heroic things, big things. The Old Testament is a bit different. It's different in that it takes a look a bit more at what you might call ordinary life. I just sort of outlined below a little bit what I think might be defined as a sort of looking at ordinary life, looking at people as part of a system that might be determined as the human condition. You've heard me mention that human condition before. And the human condition may very well involve good behavior and otherwise. Now, how are we going to learn more about this for the next couple of years? We're going to be looking at some of the things that we have in the Old Testament that tell us a lot about the human condition. Also, we're going to find out that a lot of this is quite informative in terms of some of the things that have been observed by the archaeologists and history that has been developed. In other words, our understanding of the secular history of that period. Let's look at this. Here's the Bible. This is the Bible the way we look at it today. And when I say we, I mean Protestants look at the Bible in terms of the Old Testament and the New Testament. The New Testament we talked about a little bit last week. It is written for the most part in classical Greek history, using the style of Thucydides and Herodotus. We're not going to talk very much about it anymore. On the other hand, the Old Testament is a bit more interesting in some regards. We got these 39 books. How many of you didn't memorize when you were kids these various parts of the Old Testament? We had the Torah, the law, we had the history, and then we had the poetry, the major prophets and the minor prophets. I had to learn that at one point. One thing that I found interesting in tracking some of these things down is how many different variations there are to something that we accept in the Protestant faith. It turns out that this Old Testament that we have here is essentially the same as the Hebrew Masoretic text, the text that has been used by the Jews since the year 1000. It has some bearing in that regard. Let's take a look at these sections of the Old Testament again. We have the law and we have history. Now these are the books of history that we have in our Bible, but we don't spend much time on some parts of the history in this course because we don't spend much time talking about Chronicles and Ezra and Nehemiah anyway. And we'll see some reasons for this. But on the other hand, we do have these other books that we consider to be history. Now Ruth is included here, and should actually not be included in the sections that I'm going to show in a moment. The poetry, you can't read this down here. The poetry that we learned, there were 5. It took a while before the Song of Solomon became included. Then we have these prophets. Let's take a look at this another time. From the standpoint of getting that information, in contrast to the situation with what I'll say with Homer. Homer dealt with only a very small period of time in which he was writing. Couldn't be better than maybe a few months, or at the most a couple of years. And when we look at the Old Testament, we're going to look at material that was written we regard it as being written as far back as 1000 BC, all the way up to around 400 BC. That's about, 600 years of written material. Written by whom? Quite a number of people. Now, try to get some sense out of that. We find that it's kind of an interesting operation in many regards that has in many ways been solved. By going back to what we do know, now I have found that some of the slides that I'm now going to show might contradict each other once in a while. And the reason they do that is because there is a complete settlement on just when certain things were adopted. There is one thing that does set in mind that's quite nice, however, and that there seemed to have been an idea that there were three very definite sections to the Bible, or let's put it this way, to the scriptures as at the time of Jesus. There was, we'll talk about, there was the Torah, there were the 5 books, that's the 5 books of Moses. There's the Nephilim, I'm not sure how that's pronounced, but that's the prophets that we'll be talking about quite extensively, not all of the prophets. And the Ketuvim, I cannot say that one, the writings or the things like the Psalm. Let's take a look at the next slide. Jesus himself actually makes reference to these 3 sections. In the book of Luke, he talks about the fact that he said unto them, these are the words spake unto you while I was yet with you, that all things must be fulfilled, which were written in the law of Moses. That's the Torah. That's those 5 books of Moses. And the Proverbs. We're going to look at that very distinctly as being maybe about 6 different books. That's all. And the Psalms. The Psalms, what's he referring to here? These things are talking about things like Psalms and Proverbs and Ecclesiastes and Songs of Solomon and things of that sort. We're not going to say very much about that in this course, but quite a bit about the Torah or the law and quite a bit about the prophets. As far as the songs point out that they are a very definite part of Hebrew history, which we'll mention later on. It's a section that I don't think I can cover, but we ought to have somebody that knows something about music say something about it. The contents then of the Old Testament are the law, the prophets, and Nephilim. I looked up these words and tried to get the pronunciation, and the people that they have pronouncing them pronounce them so fast I couldn't understand what they said. Nephilim, what they're talking about are those 6 books, the writings. Sometimes you call it the Ketuvim or something of that sort. This was kind of an interesting thing. Well, I don't know if that slide shows it or not, but the Tanakh is the description of those scriptures, those 3 sections. And the word comes from what? The first letters of Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim. I can't say the word. That's where the word Tanakh, when the Jews then talk about the Tanakh, they're talking about those 3 sections. Now, this slide is kind of interesting, and it's the only slide I can say that actually goes out of its way to separate some of these books. The Torah is pretty straightforward. These 5 books are the books of Moses. If you take a look at this, you're taking a look at Joshua and Judges, that's 2 books, and taking a look at Samuel, and we mean Samuel 1 and Samuel 2, and Kings 1 and Kings 2. These are the Nephilim, or what we call the Deuteronomic history. These are all prophets whose writings and oracles were later adopted and canonized in the Bible that we have today. But they don't come as part of our discussion of what we're going to approach with the subject of getting at these stories. This is the section on the writings. I want to say a word, however, about the canonization. The Bible that we have is said to be the canon. And what does that word canon mean? I looked it up and found out there were different ways that people have described it. But one of the things that seems to go way, way back in both the Greek and I think in Hebrew history is that it is related to the word reed. A reed is a tall, straight, narrow weed, but it grows very straight. And the reed is often used as what? As a standard of what is straight. And in referring to some parts of the Bible as being the canon, we're saying those are the things that are straight, and they can be used as the rule to determine whether or not it's significant. What we find is that the Torah was actually canonized as far back maybe as about 400 BC. We'll talk a little bit more about that. The prophets, we don't know exactly when they were canonized, but the writings were not canonized until when? About 100 or so AD. Actually, they were canonized at the Council of Jamia. I don't think I have that slide. I want to go back to what I mentioned before here, and that is that the Torah was canonized around 400 BC. In the book of Nehemiah, we read that all the people were gathered as one into the square before the water gate. And they told Ezra, the scribe, to bring the book of law of Moses that had been canonized and to have it read. And Ezra then, the priest, brought the law before them and read it. I've actually got a picture of that, I think. This is a very, very significant part of the Old Testament when the law or the Torah was read to the Israelites around 400 BC. The law being what? The law of Moses, or the books of Moses. I'll get a little bit more to that a little bit later. The canon, that what I just mentioned here, is well, like I mentioned here, that this took place at the Council of Jamnia. This was a very interesting period. It's about 100 AD. It's about 70 years after Christ. And it's right on the coast of the Mediterranean, the upper part of Judah, where the Jews got together, canonized the Old Testament, and also outlawed any Jews attending any Christian services. They were setting themselves apart from Christianity. There were some doubts at 100 BC, 100 AD, some doubts as to whether the Song of Solomon should be included in the canon. Does anybody want to think about that a little bit? Well, go and read the Song of Solomon sometime, and you'll say, yes, does this belong? It is a description of the love between a husband and his wife. And there were folks that felt that it sometimes got a little bit too descriptive. The Pentateuch, on the other hand, are these 5 books that we refer to as the Torah. I outline these books here as Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, and Deuteronomy. You notice I put Deuteronomy in italics. Deuteronomy, in a sense, really does not belong here. We don't really know. We'll talk about it quite a bit later on. These are the 5 books of the books of the law when we talk about the Torah. The reason I got the asterisk here is that the Deuteronomy was written at a period that was different from when the other periods were written. I'll say something about that. The historic section of the Old Testament we get largely from the Pentateuch. That's the part we're looking at in Sunday school right now. All the stories that we have in Genesis, and then later on all the stories involving Moses and the migration from Egypt to the Promised Land. The Deuteronomic history covers a period from the time that the Israelites crossed the Jordan River to go into Palestine after being in the desert supposedly for 40 years. It covers a period from about 1200 BC to about 560 BC. That is right in the middle of the period that the people were in exile in Babylon. And there is material in the Deuteronomic histories that actually indicates that the writer knew about what was going on in Babylon. Chronicles is also a period of history, a different period, but as I say, we'll talk about that another time. The Deuteronomic history, I want to say something about that. That involves what? That involves Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, and 1st and 2nd Kings. When they are added together with the book of Deuteronomy, this becomes a heptitude, because it turns out that these books, Joshua, Judges, and Samuel and Kings, relate much more to the book of Deuteronomy than the book of Deuteronomy relates to the rest of the Torah. It seems to stand out by itself, and most history students seem to like to point it out that way. I've written down here that this was written by Jeremiah. You'll notice there's a question mark. But we'll see all the reasons for thinking that Jeremiah might well have been the author of these books. Chronicles, again, we don't know how reliable it is. It is possibly written by Ezra. But we want to talk about this from another standpoint now. And that is, how did some of these books actually get to be adopted as canon? We're going to talk about the documentation or the documentary hypothesis of the formation of the Torah. Moses is supposedly the writer of the 5 books. That's what I learned when I was young. You probably have learned that as well. I want to take a look at another old slide that I have here that's, I think, of interest, and that is that very likely this canonization of the Old Testament took place at about this time, about 100 years after the New Testament era. After that era, we have the rest of the Roman Empire, the Dark Ages, the medieval times, all the way up until the time of the Renaissance, starting around 15 or 1400 BC, and then it is followed by the period of enlightenment. Now, why did I make that slide? Here are the Pentateuch. Because of a doctrine that sort of existed at that time, the inerrancy of the Bible. This word, which I cannot pronounce right now, is the belief that everything that is written in the Bible is the truth. And there's nothing that is true other than what is in the Bible. And if you want the truth, you go to the Bible. Some equate does anybody know how to pronounce that? Inerrancy. Inerrancy. Says the same thing as infallibility. In other words, what is written in those books is infallible. Don't question it. When I read this, it reminded me very much of a story that I was told many years ago about a man that was interested in converting to Catholicism. And he was talking with a Catholic friend of his, and his friend said, "You have some problems?" He said, "Yes, I have some problems." Well, I said, "Give me an example." I said, "What about the infallibility of the Pope?" And the Catholic said, "You have a problem with it? The Holy Father is infallible. What else is bothering you?" Don't think any further than that. And that's pretty much what went on for over 1,000 years, that nobody really paid too much attention to what was written there in terms of whether it really was quite reasonable. I found something kind of interesting about the time I was putting this together. I saw an evangelist on television holding up the Bible and saying, "The truth of all science and history is right here." Well, I don't think I would suggest going into an examination with the Bible without in chemistry if you didn't know a few other things as well. And it was in this period of the Renaissance that people start to look at things a little bit differently and question things a bit differently. One of the classic stories that we have from that period of the Renaissance is that of Galileo. Galileo has to be regarded as probably the father of the scientific method. He's regarded as one of the greatest scientists that ever lived because he established so many of the ideas that are currently used in scientific investigation to this day. About 50 or 100 years before that, there was a Polish astronomer by the name of Copernicus, who had been studying astronomy for a long time and came up with an interesting idea, and that is that the Earth actually revolved around the sun, and the Earth itself was rotating once every day. That theory was not looked on very well. The reason for that, the book of Ecclesiastes says, the sun rises and the sun goes down and hastens to a place where it rises. In other words, the Bible says it's the sun that moves, not the earth. What do you think they did to Galileo? Because he believed what Copernicus says. He was subjected to a what? He was subjected to an inquisition. He was questioned by all the church fathers and made to recant the fact that he believed this. There is a story that Galileo did actually recant and say, all right, I'll go along with you. But as he was leaving the room, he said, but it still moves. They're not going to change that. This is kind of interesting. This period of enlightenment I will be going through rather carefully. I'm going to just show a bunch of people that were very instrumental from about 1600 on in starting to examine the Bible very, very carefully. I won't go into any of these people, except I will mention this man. This is Spinoza, not just because he is a Dutchman, but also the fact that Spinoza comes up with some interesting ways of thinking about things. Spinoza got very interested in studying the Bible very carefully because he said God had given him the ability to think, and it would be not right for him not to think. An interesting idea. But he got into real trouble when, because of his thinking, he pointed out to the Jews and to some of the Christians some of the things about the Torah that were not right, that Moses could not have written all of this, because part of the Torah talks about the death of Moses and talks about the burial of Moses. There must have been somebody else that might have been involved. He got into a lot of trouble, and he was disowned by the Jews. The Christians wanted nothing to do with him, and he became one of the most learned men, or I'll put it this way, one of the most respected thinkers in Europe until he reached the old age of 44 when he died. He was very young. He actually spent his life as a lens maker, but they said there was a path beaten to his door of people coming from all over Europe to talk to Spinoza. This next man I find quite interesting as well. I tried to find him on the encyclopedia. I couldn't find him. But the last little bit that he has here is significant. I want to read that to you. Ostrich was the first to try to demonstrate by using the techniques of textual analysis that which were commonplace in studying the secular classics, that the theory of Genesis was composed based on several sources and manuscript traditions. In other words, he said if you look at Genesis carefully, you realize there are many different people contributing to that book of Genesis, not just one. And that led to what we call the documentary hypothesis. Now, one of the things that was very evident to the people during that time of the Enlightenment and the work that this Ostrich did was that if you look at the Torah very carefully, there are duplications. If Moses had written all of this material, then he was forgetting himself every once in a while. Well, you could say he might have had dementia or something like that. They reached the conclusion, no, there's more than one author. More than one person is writing this stuff. And it isn't just Moses. And look at the number of different places where they do find that there are two accounts of what went on as described in the Torah. The documentary hypothesis itself really came into being with Julius Wellhausen. Now, Julius Wellhausen is not the one that discovered or invented the whole thing, but he was the one that took together all the people that had been writing about the idea that there was more than one author for some of the things in the Torah, and tried to put them together into an understandable way of looking at these books. And he came up with this idea that there were different documents that were being used. Here we got the sunshine. I'll tell you what's on this slide because you can't read it anyway, but it's abbreviated on this next slide. Well, I'll have to tell you what's on here. The documentary hypothesis says that if you look very carefully, there are three very definite sources that you can see in the Torah. There is a Yahweh source, and that was probably written about the time of King David, maybe as far back as 1000 BC. There was an Elohim source that was written a little bit later. It may have been written around 800, 850 BC, maybe even into the 700 BC. And then there was the priestly writings. Now, on this particular slide, I listed the priestly writings as being the priestly writings as being arrived at around the time that the Israelites came back from being in captivity in Babylon. But there are a lot of reasons to believe that some of it there are some reasons for believing that it may have been written as early as the time of Isaiah, as far back as around 700 to 750 BC, that some of the priestly writings were. That those three very definite sources were there. And there was another source. There was another source that you could not see here, but it's on this slide that we can't look at. The source that's down at the bottom. There was a Deuteronomic source. There is absolutely no evidence in the first four books of the Torah, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, of anything involving the Deuteronomist. None at all. The other three do show up rather prominently. The Deuteronomist shows up in only one book that we have in the Torah. And what is that? The book of Deuteronomy. The book of Deuteronomy was written entirely by the Deuteronomists. We'll take a look at that a little bit later on. Okay. There are some things, however, I want to say about the priestly source. We don't know when it came. Like I say, it may have been as early as 700, 750 BC. We don't know. But there are some things that are very characteristic of it. And I mentioned some of these things. It is cold and unemotional, and it treats God in a transcendental plane. In other words, it is not in a nice, homey sort of an atmosphere. As a matter of fact, I did read one account about the priestly source, and it said that what the priestly source had done was take what was available from the Yahwist and the Elohist sources, and to rewrite the whole history of the history of the Israelites, in terms of what is in the Elohist and the Yahwist, which were written earlier, but leave all that storytelling out and make it all centered on the temple and centered on rituals and centered on genealogies and centered on the festivals and all the things that were related to religion. Leave all that other stuff out. This one critic said, it is there and it is accurate and is as dry as bones. You can hardly read through it, but it is accurate. But it is in the Torah. It is used in the Torah. This is a very useful chart. This will take some while to learn, but it's worth getting acquainted with. J here stands for the Yahwist. J doesn't sound like Yahwist. Well, it comes from the German word for Yahweh, which is Yah with a J. J and E are the Elohist. J and E were very often combined together because they told stories about people. They told the stories that we like to refer to as the Bible stories. And these J-E sources that we have were combined and were brought into the Torah, along with some of the priestly sources. Here are the priestly sources. They come into the Torah. Then we have R. Anybody know what R means? It means a redactor. These are the editors. These are the people that edited these materials before they were actually put into the Torah. The redactors do play a rather significant role, and every once in a while we do see evidence that the redactor is making contributions to the Torah. But now look on the other side. What we have to conclude is that the Deuteronomist got some of the material that he had used from the Yahweh and the Elohist. And from that, he, and with a little bit of material completely on his own, came up with a Deuteronomic source, a little bit, a Deuteronomic source that made its way into the Torah, but for the most part came out as the book of Deuteronomy. Is this a little confusing? If you study it for a while, it just starts to make some pretty good sense. Really quite important here are these R's dealing with these redactors that are taking these various parts and trying to put them into some semblance of order. This is a very important slide. I'm going to read most of it to you since you probably can't read it. The priestly source takes out about 55% of the books of the first four books. 55% of the Pentateuch. If we break this down, 20% of the book of Genesis is from P, or from that's not right. It is from P. 50%. 20% of Genesis is from the priesthood. 50% of Exodus, and of course 100% of Leviticus is all from the priestly source. That's quite a bit of the Torah already. Its presence is more than twice the size of any other individual source. It is the predominant source of what we have in the Torah. Let's see what. Okay, and then reading. Let me get the other glasses here, because I can't read that distance. Okay. Approximately 17% of the Pentateuch is from the Elohist, 18% was written by the Deuteronomists, 20% by the Yahwists, and a whopping 45% by the priestly sources. In other words, it is the biggest part of the Torah. Here's a more graphic way of looking at it. Oh, that's too bad that doesn't show up a little better here. We have the four different sources. I think you could probably make out on this source that most of the Deuteronomic source is going into the book of Deuteronomy, which is standing by itself. These are the other four books. And if you could look at those very carefully, you would find out, for example, that when you get to the book of Leviticus, it's almost entirely from the priestly source. Also, quite a bit of what we have in Exodus and quite a bit of what we have in Numbers also come from the priestly source. There's an awful lot of what we have in both of these books that also deal with the things that the priestly source wanted to get across. Now I ask the question, how did this all get put together to give the Torah if we have all these different sources? This has always been an object of a lot of study. One of the more recent ones came from Richard Friedman, and I'm inclined to agree with what he has to say, and that is that we probably can ascribe the formation of the Torah from these different sources from Ezra, from the Ezra that I mentioned before. Ezra was the one that redacted the Torah. In other words, he was the one that took the priestly source, the Elohist source, and the Yahweh source, and tried to put them all together into a single story that we have in the Torah. That sounds like quite an undertaking. Well, it is quite an undertaking. Well, I mentioned something about Ezra that I think is rather important here, and that Ezra is also mentioned as a scribe as well as being a priest. He was a priest, and there's a lot of evidence of the fact that he was a priest of a given sort. We call a Zadokite priest. We'll talk about later in the year that he was a Zadokite priest, that his influence played a rather significant role in putting that Torah together. Here's one picture I could find of Ezra as a scribe. Here's the documentary hypothesis in terms of those three principal sources. You don't have to worry. This is. I wish you could see this. I'll tell you, in the future, we're going to have to flick this over and find another place to put the screen. See if we can find a way that we can see what's on the screen.
I saw
Here,
that, tell them I'm gonna send them a copy of these slides.
what was that?
Remember, we talked about you giving me the slides, and I will circulate it to the class.
Oh, okay.
Not tell them that, because they may not hear me anymore.
Oh, okay. We're trying to figure, it might be that corner or something like that. So, of course, I don't know what would happen when we start teaching in the regular class, because that's where the screen's going to be. And as you recall from the past, we've always had problems with the sun blocking off the screen. Anyway, here's a section from the documentary hypothesis. And I wish you could read this right now, because can you see a little bit of this? What you have here are J, E, E, and D. Well, we don't have any contributions to speak of from D here, but when we look at the story of the Red Sea that we find in the book of Exodus, we find contributions of the priestly, of the Elohist, and the Yahweh sources. Why? Because all three sources felt that this was a significant part of the history, and they all recorded something about it. And when Ezra put this together, he made use of all three sources. Now, if we could look at this more carefully, you would take a look here at, this is verse 19. These are all out of chapter 14. Verse 19 and 20 start out with an Elohim source, but 19 and 20 end up with what? A Yahweh source. In other words, we find that there was a lot of work that went into putting this together. You can't read this, but you notice the different colors here? I've taken chapter 14 and I've highlighted it myself. The red that you have here the red are the priestly sources. The black are the Yahweh sources. And then moving a little bit further, you find out a whole lot of it turns out to be the Elohim source. All of this is showing up. Showing up where? It's showing up in that chapter 14, indicating that Ezra had to put these things together. Here is taking those chapter 14, verses 19 and 20. They start out in one way and end up in another way. Before I leave that, I want to point out that this was quite an undertaking when you stop and think about it, that Ezra started from scratch, not knowing where he was going or where it was leading. And somehow or another, he had managed to do this to the point that by 400 BC, he was to take the 5 books of Moses, the Torah, and say, okay, this is the scriptures. And from that point on, we sort of regarded that as being the beginning of the canonization, of saying, okay, there is a part of the Bible that we can ascribe to as far back as 400 BC. But now let's turn to the Deuteronomic history. The Deuteronomic history is interesting in that it consists of not only the 6 books that I mentioned, Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, but also the book of Deuteronomy. It is often included, and instead of talking about the Pentateuch being the 5 books, they talk about the Tetraptych being the first 4 books of the Torah, and about the Heptateuch being the 7 books which involve Deuteronomy as well as those 6 books that we regard as the books of history. Why is that significant? Well, again, we all should be able to read. Because we find out that there's a very definite pattern that we find in all of those books. I might mention, by the way, that the parts of the history that show up in the Bible, in my version of the NIV, is over 200 pages. 200 pages are just devoted to this time. And all of it seems to follow a very given pattern based on what? Based on the book of Deuteronomy. We find out that the Deuteronomist, when he was writing, was keeping in mind what was written, what the Deuteronomic historian was saying, was based on what was written in the book of Deuteronomy. Now, what was in the book of Deuteronomy? The book of Deuteronomy has a very interesting background which we'll come across when we go through the Deuteronomic histories of how that book was discovered, and find that it was written in such a way as to say, this is the farewell address of Moses to the Israelites just before they crossed the Jordan River to go into Palestine. He gives them a background of the things in the book of Deuteronomy, of what they had undergone when they were of leaving Egypt and spending the 40 years in the desert, and now they're about to cross over into the promised land. And they were also in that period given the law. And if we read Numbers and we read Exodus, we find out the law was expressed to them during that period that they were in the desert on the way to Palestine. They were given the law. And near the end, I think it's on chapter 18 or somewhere around there, the Deuteronomist or the author of Deuteronomy makes the statement, this promised land is going to be yours forever, as long as you follow the law. You will be rewarded as long as you are a righteous people. But if you are an unrighteous people, you're going to lose the land. And you're going to lose the promised land. That idea of the fact that the righteous will be rewarded and the unrighteous will be punished is permeated through the whole of the Deuteronomic histories in the most interesting fashion, which we're going to constantly be pointing out. I'm going to give you just couple of real quick examples of the sort of thing that we're going to encounter, and you'll see why this becomes so important that the book of Deuteronomy is included along with the Deuteronomic histories. If you go to the book of Judges, you'll find out that it is even stated in the book of Judges that there seemed to be a pattern that the people were following, that they would be a righteous people, then they would worshiping idols and get into a lot of problems. They would find a judge, and then they would return back to God. There was a pattern, there was a cycle. Probably a more, I think, illuminating one is one of the things that is quite significant in the whole book of the Old Testament, and that is the story of David. If you take a look at the story of David as we have it in the Deuteronomic histories, as we have it in Samuel 2 for the most part, and part of Samuel 1, you find out that David started out as a boy shepherd who eventually actually became a leader and was made the king of Judah in where? In Hebron, and eventually was able actually to convince the people in the northern tribes to join him to form the united king under a single monarchy, under the monarchy of David. David then moved his throne to Jerusalem. And what we're told there, that bringing the tabernacle back into Jerusalem was a great time of rejoicing. And we find David at the very pinnacle of his reign as the king. And then he met Bathsheba. And with Bathsheba, he got involved in the problem of adultery. And then with his nephew, Joab, conspired in the murder of Uriah. He was no longer the righteous king that he was. Read the rest of the book of Samuel, 2 Samuel, and you find out the rest of David's life was misery, The very thing he has to encounter is the murder of one of his sons against a stepbrother, because the stepbrother had raped his stepsister, so he murders him. Then that son goes into hiding. And we find that David mourns over the fact that he has lost a son by murder, and another one that's gone on. The one that comes back from hiding comes back, and guess what he does? Leads a revolt against his father, so that David actually had to flee out of Jerusalem because of what was going on. And we go further, we find out that when David became very old, he was so old they had to bring a young girl to see if they could revive him in some way or all. But he was too old to even respond to the fact that he had a young person around him. And the last thing that we read about David is he had to put up with a great big fight that was going on between his sons as to whom was going to actually become the new king. During the righteous period, he was rewarded. During the period after the sin, he was punished. This sort of thing shows up over and over again in the Deuteronomic histories. And if it were not for that book of Deuteronomy, it would be kind of hard maybe to understand why it is written the way that it is. When was this book of Deuteronomy written? That is very interesting in itself. Obviously, if it's going to cover the period all the way from the time that the Israelites moved into Palestine from crossing the Jordan River around 1200 BC to the time of the exile, it's going to have to be written when he knows something about the exile. It was written very late in this Deuteronomic era. We think it was written about the time that the Babylonians were starting to cause some real problems as far as conquering Jerusalem and taking the Israelites into captivity. And probably written there at that time from this standpoint. Let's point out what our history was like and why we are about to be punished. We were a righteous people, but because we fell away from worshiping in the proper manner, this is why we're dealing with the problem of the Babylonians on top of us right now. We'll be far more specific about that when we get to that section of the Deuteronomic histories as we go through the books of Samuel. The person that they think might have written this might have been Jeremiah. One of the things that's interesting is that we can tell from the writing of that period that the writer himself was very intimately involved in the times that were actually taking place before the Babylonians came into Jerusalem. And we get a reflection of his own feelings in that fashion. And, well, we have to really get into the history. We find out that so many of these things are quite dependent on history that has taken place in other ways. I was thinking about something on the way here. I've got about 5 minutes left, and that is that actually when you look at the history of some of these things as to why you find that Ezra was so vehement about some of the things that he wrote about in the priestly histories, you can probably put part of the blame on Bathsheba, but it takes a long time to tell that story of why Bathsheba would actually be involved in this. That period of history is very well documented, indicating that the writer very likely was intimately involved in part of it. This is where the writings that we have in the book of Kings in particular indicate that he was getting background from other sources than his own experience. And this is a list of some of the places. There is a background concerning the time that the Jews were in, or the Israelites were in Shiloh. And then we have the annals of the kings of Israel, the kings of Judah, and the court history, which is sometimes described as one of the most detailed bits of history that we find anywhere in the written literature. And we'll see that when we get to that part of the history. I might mention here in closing that although the vast material that we have available to us in the Deuteronomic histories and in the Torah are the source of the Bible stories, most of them come from the Torah or they come from the Deuteronomic histories. There are a few Bible stories, however, that come from Jeremiah, and maybe one that may be coming from the book of Isaiah. But for the most part, we can always go back to the Torah or go back to the Deuteronomic histories and say, this is where this Bible story came from. Now, what is it that we're going to be doing with these Bible stories? Getting acquainted with them, not only as the story as it evolves in the Bible, but as it evolves in terms of these things taking place in a period of history. Because what we find is that the secular history of the things that were going on around them played a rather significant role in the way that people actually behaved. I would say that the same thing would be very true with most stories that you read about, and that if you read about people, you find out that the stories that you read about concerning these people are affected and very much by the period in which they are living. And the period in which they're living is going to have an impact on what they are doing. The thing, however, that is rather significant in the stories that we find both in the Torah and that we find in the Deuteronomic histories is this idea of the human condition. How much these stories allow us to look at them with the idea, hey, I can understand this. Because these are people that are undergoing the sort of things that people undergo. They're not like the heroes in Homer's poetry, where they get involved in heroic deeds. We find these people involved in rather what you might say everyday occurrences because they are everyday people. But we can understand them. We can understand them better. And this makes the writing that we find by both the Yahwists and the Elohists so significant, and being able to find this element of the human condition that it shows up in the Torah and in the Deuteronomic histories. What do I usually say at the end of a period?
Read it in.
The end.